Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. We're going to wait just a few minutes to make sure that we have everyone logged in. All right, see people are joining now. So yes, hi everyone, good morning. Thank you for joining us. My name is Rohini Singh and I'm the director of the School Justice Project at Advocates for Children of New York. And today we will be discussing accessing behavioral health supports in schools. So just some logistical notes before we get started. Once again, sorry, my screen disappeared for a second. There we go. Just some logistical notes before we get started. I'm going to wait to answer specific questions until designated points in the presentation, but you could feel free to use the Q&A feature at any time during the presentation as questions come up. I'm joined today by another AFC staff member, Ross Baker, our school discipline and special education advocate, who will be monitoring the Q&A and will either answer your question directly or flag it for me to answer or discuss during the PowerPoint presentation. Another note about questions, this presentation will be recorded and put on our YouTube channel. And so if you have any specific questions about your child's circumstances and would rather not have them discussed in the recorded segment, we'll try to leave a few minutes at the end to stop recording and answer any of those questions. This always comes up, but yes, you will definitely receive a copy of the PowerPoint at the end of the presentation after the presentation is completed. In addition, at the end, we'll have a survey for you to fill out with just a few survey questions. So please fill that out at the end as well. Great. So I think we have enough participants here. So let's get started with some polling questions so we have a better sense of who's here. And we'll wait till we have enough participants. Great. I see we have some parents, some other professionals, representation across from most boroughs in the city, which is great to see. So you can get a few more folks. Great. All right.
Yeah, launch another one.
Okay. I think we just have one more quick poll. Is that what you said, Ross?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. And this information helps us gather data so we know who we're reaching and how we can tailor our presentation. So thank you so much for answering these. All right. I think we have the same level of participation. There we go. All right. So I am going to turn it over to Ross. Once again, as I mentioned before, for those that maybe joined a little late, you will definitely get a copy of this PowerPoint after the presentation. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A and Ross or I will be able to answer them either just directly in the Q&A or live during the presentation. So turn it over to you, Ross.
Sure. So just to start, I'm going to give a little bit of a roadmap of today's training. So we're going to start with introductions, as we did earlier, and we're also going to talk a little bit more about AFC generally. Then we're going to do an overview of the topic, behavioral supports today. We're going to talk about supports that are available for all students, and then a few more supports for students with disabilities. And then we're going to discuss some tips and strategies for managing behavior, de-escalation, that sort of thing. And then we're going to go to problem solving towards the end, which is how to escalate or who to reach out to in the DOE if you're having any issues. Just a note, I do see that there's a raised hand. If possible, could you put your question in the Q&A? And just a note here, neither of us are clinicians, so as we get to the tips and strategies part, these are just some things that we have heard from the clinicians that we work with, and successful strategies from other professionals and parents that we work with. So I just wanted to give folks a heads up on that. Okay, so what is Advocates for Children? AFC is an independent agency that protects the educational rights of all New York City students. We have a helpline that's open from Mondays through Thursdays, 10 to 4. Um, and all of our helpline specialists speak English and Spanish. And then we also have a language line if you need support in another language. We have plenty of guides and resources like these on our website. Um, I know we actually have another webinar coming up towards the end of this month on court-involved youth. And then we offer workshops and trainings like this ones. And then we also offer free legal services to low-income families along with direct advocacy. Um, So, um, up next, we're going to talk about social, emotional, and behavioral supports. It's important to note that social emotional learning is the process through which all people acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal or collective goals. Feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. It's important to know that schools are not just responsible for providing students with spaces for academic learning, but also for social emotional learning and development as well. Um, so we're going to talk about what supports are available in New York City public schools here. So why is this important? Um, I think it has been well documented that especially after the COVID pandemic, um, things have changed, and there's been a lot more of a need for social, emotional, and behavioral supports in schools. Um, uh, there is throughout over the pandemic and after the pandemic, we saw an increase in anxiety and depression among young people. And we've also seen this manifest in school avoidant behaviors, inappropriate behaviors in school. Um, so, um, yeah, this is to keep students safe and then also to make sure that their uh, learning environments are safer. So, as you can see, these are just headlines from the past few years. Um, but, throughout COVID, people were separated from support systems, separated from normal learning and socializing and engaging with peers. So I think we've noticed that it's been a very challenging time for our young people in school. Um, so stress and trauma that can happen at home or in school has a distinct impact on learning. Um, and this creates competition for energy and attention if home life is unstable. And then students are then less available to learn and potentially exhibit more challenging behaviors, such as aggression or withdrawal or disassociation. So when students are less available to learn, they're more likely to um, exhibit they're more likely to exhibit challenging behaviors at school. So just before we get into some of the supports available, we just wanted to talk about some parents' rights. So both Rohini and I are on the School Justice Project at Advocates for Children, and we do a lot of work around students and parents' rights along with school discipline. So while this presentation won't cover a lot of the discipline piece, um, we do just want to advise parents of their rights in the event of discipline, even though we're focusing a little bit more here on what supports are available. So first and foremost, the school should not ask you to keep your child at home, ask you repeatedly to pick up your child from school early, or ask you to remain in the classroom with your child because of their behavior. Um, just a note, the reason we include these things is because we do see them happening from time to time. So we do know that this happens. But this is just like a legal guideline or framework for what's allowed and what's not allowed. The school should not exclude your child from after school activities or field trips because of their behavior. The school should not hold over your child. The school should not repeatedly complain to you, and the school should not repeatedly suspend your child. So all of these things are can kind of function as uh, triggers or a notice that it might be time to think more about behavioral supports and ask the school for more supports if you're seeing a school do this a lot. So the school should notify you if they use a physical or mechanical restraint on your child or if a student is placed in a timeout room. The school should not request school safety agent or police assistance to manage your child's behavioral or mental health issues or discipline your child. The school should not call 911 when your child has behavioral or mental health challenges in school unless it is a true emergency. And then the school should not refer a student to virtual learning because of their behavior in the class. So all students should be in the classroom, um, even if they're exhibiting challenging behaviors. And the school should be working collaboratively with families, providers, caregivers, to ensure that the student has support so they can remain in the classroom. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about different types of school-based supports. So here we have 5 buckets. We have at-risk counseling, informal behavior interventions, crisis de-escalation plans, students in temporary housing, community coordinators, and then school-based mental health services. So at-risk counseling is usually offered on a time-limited basis. This is usually if a student is dealing with a somewhat time-limited issue, whether it's in school or out of school, and this is done with a school social worker, a guidance counselor, or psychologist. This isn't always in a student's IEP or 504 plan, but sometimes it is. But this is typically a time-limited um, period of counseling over 8 to 12 weeks or a few months. The next is informal behavior interventions. So this can be behavior tracker in class, some sort of behavior contract that a family and a teacher and a student or in a school come up with, or perhaps a para, um, or check-ins at the beginning or end of days. A crisis de-escalation plan is for students who are acutely in crisis or have exhibited behaviors before where they've been in crisis. But this identifies locations in the school building where a student may be safely isolated from others. It identifies any school staff engaged in or trained specifically in crisis de-escalation techniques, and identifies in-school and community resources to support a student uh, as they're de-escalating. School-based mental health services. Each school has some type of mental health support for students, and we're going to talk a little bit more about different types of mental health services and what they look like. But some of these interventions can be formally in an IEP or in a 504, and there's quite a broad range. But we're going to talk a little bit about those specific services and then also how to find them on your school's website. And then lastly, some schools have students in temporary housing community coordinators. These are community coordinators who are assigned to schools with large populations of students in shelter, and they help support youth in temporary housing. Students in foster care can also receive support from these staff. Um, and these aren't necessarily mental health providers, but they offer social and emotional support to students. So, okay. We got a message in the chat, I think. If possible, it would be helpful to put them in the Q&A so we can answer broadly. But for now, I'm going to continue here. So these are some types of school-based mental health services. So school response clinicians are typically a central team of clinical social workers who are available to assist schools when responding to students in emotional distress, as well as provide citywide training along with professionals in a school setting. The school mental health prevention and intervention program is only in 42 schools, but it helps schools assess need for mental health services within their building with community private providers, and it sets up school programs. Um, some schools have health and hospital mental health clinic partnerships or a mental health continuum. This is available in 50 schools, and this is a partnership with outpatient adolescent mental health services in New York City health and hospitals. And students under 18 can get diagnostic evaluation, ongoing therapy, medication management, and clinical services. Sessions can be done at clinic and via telemental health. Schools or parents can make referrals for their child in the scenario. Um, Community schools and mental health programs. This is 128 schools. Some community schools have mental health services and work with community mental health programs. And then about 191 schools or 267 schools, sorry, typically have a nurse practitioner or physician assistant who may offer behavior management or support. So this is just an example of different types of programs. Um, we're going to talk in a second about how you can look these programs up. Um, so additionally, if a school has just the last note on the last one, if a school has support staff for students in temporary housing, they can also support students in foster care. So each school has a DOE website that lists the specific mental health supports in each school. So you can go to schoolsearch.schools.nyc, type in the name of the school or address and any information you have and hit search. So this is how you will go to learn what specific supports your school has or your child's school has. Um, and I guess just for folks who might have come in a little bit later, this is also a good time to remind people that we are going to send out copies of this presentation. So anytime you see a link embedded or something like that, you will be able to access it later after the presentation. So once you search, you're going to click on the mental health and wellness tab, which I think is on the next part of this. And yeah, you can see it at the bottom here. This is like a typical landing page for New York City public schools. And this is just an example we used, but you'll click on the mental health and wellness tab, and then you'll be able to see the different types of supports they have. So you can see for this one, there's a school-based mental health clinic, which is one of the available supports that we had. They have some direct contacts for who to reach out to for behavioral supports or mental health support. And it's going to vary across schools, but this is how you find it for your student-specific school. Okay, so now we're going to we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the discipline code and how it relates to behavior supports. So just to start, as you can see, there are two separate documents here. There's a discipline code or behavioral expectations to support students learning from grades K to 5 and one for students grades 6 to 12. This is because I think disciplinary responses and supports look a little different for students of different ages. But although this is technically a discipline code, this is also a guide on students' rights and responsibilities, along with a resource that has information about available supports for students and the responsibilities of schools to support students and offer positive behavior interventions and to adhere to the concept of progressive discipline, which we'll talk about in just a second. So in the DOE's mission statement, and just for shorthand, when we say DOE here, we are talking about New York City. I think they rebranded to New York City Public Schools, so we might use the terms DOE and New York City Public Schools interchangeably. But for this presentation, if we're saying DOE, we're referring to New York City Public Schools, unless otherwise explicitly stated. So in the Department of Education's mission statement, overly punitive methods of discipline are not in the best interest of students. Students are better served by providing positive supports that teach students social, emotional, and behavioral skills. They aim to provide enhanced support to students with special needs or those suffering from trauma due to exposure to poverty or violence. And New York City will reduce the use of suspensions as a disciplinary tool, sorry. So what this all says basically is that the DOE is interested, at least in their mission statement, they're interested in supporting students and providing behavioral supports as opposed to addressing behavior through punitive measures or excessive disciplinary tools. That's not to say that suspensions don't happen and they are completely legal. But in the Department of Education's mission statement and their most recent guidance, they do aim to use suspensions to reduce the use of suspensions and reduce the use of punitive methods. So it's always helpful to have this in mind and bring this up if you're ever engaging with New York City public schools and you feel like they are immediately resorting to something punitive or some sort of punishment. So New York City public schools have embraced restorative justice. They have some restorative justice coordinators in schools, and I think they're working on expanding their program. So restorative justice is an intervention that replaces punishment and focuses on repairing relationships. Some types of restorative practices are collaborative negotiation, a circle process, peer mediation, conflict resolution, and formal restorative conferencing. And then why advocate for it? So it can improve a student's behavior, it lowers incidence of repeated misbehavior, and it contributes to a more positive school environment by fostering respect for one another. So although the DOE does have the ability to, suspend students, we always advocate for more restorative practices, especially because it's better to repair things at the school level and especially make sure that you're rebuilding community if there are issues or behavioral infractions or something like that. So social emotional learning curriculum in schools focuses on building community and resilience. All staff are trained in trauma responsible education practices. Activities vary based on grade. The DOE has many partnerships like we talked about before. But this is something where the DOE emphasizes strengthening partnerships and building community and fostering resilience rather than engaging in, more punitive measures. So with that said, I'm going to switch over to, well, we have an opportunity for questions. Like we said before, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. We'll try to answer as we go. But for right now, I'm going to hand things off to Rohini, who's going to talk a little bit more about additional supports for students with disabilities.
Thank you, Ross. And I think the key thing, Ross's presentation really focused on behavior supports that are available in DOE schools for all students. A lot of the supports that we mentioned, they may or may not be available in your school. It's the way that the programs are is it's not every school has the same level of support. The key thing is it's important to know that these supports do exist, and you can ask your school either a school social worker, a guidance counselor, the school principal, if they have access to these things like social emotional learning, restorative justice, a school-based mental health clinic, things like that. And so in addition to looking at them up potentially on the school's website, you can also ask school staff about them and advocate for them. So now we're going to be turning to specific supports for students with disabilities, and the remaining behavior supports will be just for students with IEPs. I'm going to be focusing mostly on specific behavioral supports that you can request if your child is experiencing behavioral challenges so that they can remain in the school environment, the current school environment that they're in. It is important to note that your child might, given their needs, or the types of behaviors that they're experiencing, they might require, or it might be more appropriate for them to be in a new school environment or a more appropriate school placement, but that would really depend on their individual needs. And so if you feel as though your child's school is unable to support your child's behavior, then I encourage you to watch our special education webinar on our website or read through our special education guide, so you can know your rights when it comes to your child's placement and how to advocate for a new placement for your child. And I should say in general, just sort of as a caveat, we know just from our work and from our advocacy that there are very limited options for placements when it comes to students with behavioral needs. Often what we see, and I imagine what many of you might experience, is that students that are experiencing behavioral challenges are referred to New York City New York City Public Schools Specialized School District, which is called District 75. While this placement might be appropriate for some students, it's not necessarily going to be appropriate for every student. And so, what we advocate for is for schools to be providing more behavior supports in District 1 through 32 settings so that students can remain in less restrictive environments. I'll be talking a little later about different specialized school programs that exist within the DOE that might be appropriate for students that have behavioral challenges. But again, given that there are limited options, if you feel as though your child is really struggling behaviorally and the school cannot support them, we do encourage you to look at our special education guide and look at our special education webinar to think through, how to advocate for a more appropriate placement for your child. Just a quick overview of the special education process. So it starts at the point of a referral for special education and goes all the way through placement and services. And so first a referral is made either by, and this is for, the initial evaluation process for special education supports. So referral is made either by a parent or guardian or a school staff member. Then the parent has to sign consent. And, then the child would be evaluated, evaluations be conducted. They should be conducted in all areas of suspected disability. And so for a student that is struggling with behaviors, it'd be important to advocate for evaluations that try to get at or understand where the behaviors are coming from. And then from the evaluation process, an IEP is developed, and then they're provided placement and services. And this timeline from the point that you sign consent to the point where the student gets placement and services should take 60 school days. And so it's important, and I know this was a question in the chat, it's important to make sure that the process is moving, to make sure that timelines are being abided by, and we'll provide some tips later about what to do if there are delays in the process. So it's important to note, and this is something that we see for students that, who have both learning and behavioral challenges, that behavior is, again, as Ross mentioned earlier, it's a part of learning. It's a part of what a child is supposed to be, it's part of what's supposed to be addressed in a school environment. And so the law on this is very clear. The IDEA makes clear that the IEP team must, in the case of a child whose behavior impedes the child's learning or that of others, consider the use of positive behavior interventions and supports and other strategies to address that behavior. And so again, we really can't emphasize enough that behavior and social emotional support is part of learning. And for students with IEPs, it's part of what constitutes a free appropriate public education, which is what a student with an IEP is entitled to. And so this can look like different things. So as I mentioned, there's positive behavior interventions and supports that can be placed within the IEP. There are functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans, or FBAs and BIPs. A functional behavior assessment is a specialized evaluation of a student's behavior with a goal to create a behavior intervention plan to then address the underlying reasons for the behavior and work with a student to improve and change their behavior. You can also advocate for staff training and support within an IEP. If a student is experiencing a specific type of behavior and the school is not equipped to manage it, then this is something that can be advocated for and placed within an IEP in order to make sure that staff have the capacity and the ability to approach a student's specific behavioral challenges. And then, of course, the use of paraprofessionals is often, sort of like the first tool, especially for younger students that are exhibiting behavioral challenges, to try to get them the support that they need. And so some additional IEP supports and services. So there's specific assistive technology that can be requested, equipment such as sensory items, a weighted vest. As I mentioned, more individualized behavior supports like paraprofessionals, a behavior intervention plan, allowing time for school staff to consult with providers, teachers, and paraprofessionals, changes to different types of services, to sort of meet a student's specific needs. So for example, if a child is more dysregulated in the morning, maybe that's a good time for them to be pulled out for OT or things like that. So, you can advocate for very specific things within an IEP to really meet and address a young person's behavioral challenges. Scheduling regular check-ins, excuse me, sorry, technical issues. There we go. Scheduling regular check-ins with a school social worker, a guidance counselor, et cetera. Making sure that a student has a trusted adult in the building that they can talk to. Regular check-ins, discussing placement options depending on a student's specific needs. And so again, as I mentioned, if a particular school environment is not appropriate, then an IEP team should be talking about specific, like whether or not there are other placements or services that might be appropriate for the student. The key thing here is that, this is just this and the previous slide are just a few examples of things that you can be advocating for. The key thing here to emphasize is that this should be part of a conversation during the IEP process, and that these are things that you can ask for if your child is struggling behaviorally. Unfortunately, something that we do see in our work is that a student's IEP might have a lot of supports for example, their speech and language impairment, but they might not actually include information about some of their behavioral challenges or the behavior that might arise from their disability. And so this is where making sure that conversations about a student's behavior and social emotional health and growth are part of the IEP conversation. And then these are specific things that you can be asking for to make sure that your child is making progress and feeling supported and not experiencing behavioral challenges. So again, as I mentioned, one of the critical tools in terms of providing support for students with disabilities that have behavioral challenges is this functional behavior assessment and behavior intervention plan. So the FBA is an assessment. Typically, it's done by a school psychologist or a school social worker, and the idea is to identify a target behavior. So identifying what behavior needs to change. And then doing an assessment of that behavior by doing classroom observations, observing the student in different environments, asking the question, when does the behavior occur, where, how often, for how long, in order to determine what's called the function of behavior. So why does this behavior occur? So as I mentioned, an FBA is typically done by a school psychologist, a school social worker, and then the IEP team will look at that data that's collected in the FBA and then create a behavior intervention plan. Something to note is, if you do not want a DOE or a school employee to do the FBA evaluation, you can always pay for an independent assessment. We have more information about independent assessments in our special education guide. And then if the DOE has already done an FBA evaluation, but you disagree with the findings, you can request that the DOE pay for an independent assessment. To do this, you would, email the IEP team or the Committee on Special Education. If the DOE agrees to pay for the independent assessment, you will then need to choose an evaluator and ask for reimbursement. And so, it's possible to get an independent assessment authorization or an independent assessment done for this FBA assessment, because it is, again, a special education assessment. And so the goal of this is then to create what's known as a BIP. So a BIP is a plan that's supposed to prevent and address the behavior and promote positive behavior. So it takes the data from the FBA to create this plan, and it must include information about when and how often the behavior happens and how severe it is. Strategies for stopping the behavior from happening, which could include classroom changes, a new school schedule, different approaches that school staff are going to take, training that a school staff might have. I think the key thing here is that it shouldn't just be a behavior contract or something that says, X student will stop doing this behavior. It needs to be more targeted and actually address the underlying reason for the behavior and change the environment and the, what's going on around the student to try to address why the behavior is occurring. It should also include a safety plan for how to manage the behavior when it does happen, such as calming the student down, removing the student from the classroom, having the child speak with a trusted adult. It should list specific school staff who your child trusts, who will be designated to work to support your child, and who will be available to safely work with your child when the behavior does occur. And then there should be a schedule to mark progress and set future meetings so that you can remain up to date on how well the BIP is working and make changes that you feel are needed. And the schedule should be set every few weeks. And at the time that, when that scheduled date comes up, then the team should be meeting and discussing, okay, how is this working? Does anything need to be changed? Things like that. I know a lot of students have FBAs and BIPs, but, and sometimes they can be really effective, sometimes less effective. The key thing that we have found is that you really need to assess whether all staff who interact with the student are fully implementing the plan. And if not, really advocate for the school to provide them with coaching and implementation support. Even with proper implementation, the student is not progressing under the BIP, then the strategies would need to be changed, or potentially a new assessment of placement or supports for the students might be called for. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about specific programs for students, especially these specialized programs for students that have behavioral challenges within the DOE. And so all of these are programs that are available for students with IEPs. Each program has different eligibility criteria, and each has a separate application process. All of the programs can be found on the DOE's website. There will be a link in the final PowerPoint that we send around. Under the DOE's or New York City Public Schools' specialized programs webpage. And so the DOE PATH pilot program is sort of designed for students, younger students who are at risk of potentially, needing a referral or at risk for potentially being referred to District 75 due to behavioral challenges. And the idea is that it's for students who, either have an emotional disability classification or are at risk, of receiving one. And it provides intensive behavioral and social emotional supports for students. Currently, it's only in a few districts in the city, and the recommendation would be made at a Students Turning 5 IEP meeting. And so you can ask about this program at your Turning 5 IEP meeting if you think it might be appropriate, to see if there is space available in the existing sites. And, you know, or you can email the central email, pathprogram@schools.nyc.gov, for more information. There are also specific programs for students with autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. ASD Nest and Horizon can be great programs for students that have autism. Students get extra social emotional supports within a District 1 through 32 school setting, and staff get specialized training in ASD. And so Nest serves students with ASD who are at or above grade level in a reduced size integrated co-teaching class. And Horizon serves students in an 8-to-1 classes, so 8 students, 1 teacher, 1 paraprofessional, who are at or near grade level. As I'm sure many of you might know, seats are very limited, and as I mentioned before, students have to apply to the program directly. The IEP team at their school can't just recommend ASD Horizon for a student. A parent has to go, or a school should be assisting a parent in going and applying for these specific programs on the DOE's website. And we have the link here, and you'll see that there are these specialized programs for that are specific for students with autism. These are just some programs that are available for students with intellectual disabilities. Again, these are just depending on your child's individual needs. We just want to make sure you're aware that these specialized programs do exist to meet students' needs and might be appropriate for your child. Again, there's the DOE Central's website that lists all these specialized programs and sort of the process on how to apply to each of them. And so some programs for students with emotional disabilities, students with behavioral challenges. So in a community school, this can look like, general education with some supports and services. It can be an integrated co-teaching class or an ICT class, which has students with and without disabilities, and 2 teachers, a general education teacher and a special education teacher, to provide more support. Potentially a special class with 12 students, 1 teacher, 1 paraprofessional, or 15 students and 1 teacher. And all of these settings can be with or without an FBA or a BIP or a 1-to-1 paraprofessional. Again, there are many options for young people that are struggling behaviorally in a community school setting. It just requires, a lot of advocacy to try to get these supports on a student's IEP, and knowing your rights, that you do have a right to remain in a less restrictive environment, and to advocate to get to try some of these behavior supports before a school, says that they can no longer meet your child's needs. In addition, in a community school setting, there's also a program called District 75 Inclusion, which is a student would be in a general education classroom setting or an ICT setting, and then they would receive additional supports from a District 75 school staff. And so they would remain in the community school setting, but they would be receiving additional District 75 inclusion supports in that setting. And so this is, again, an option that you can advocate for if a school is saying they can no longer meet your child's needs, but you want to try to remain in a community school setting. You can ask to see if your child might be eligible for District 75 inclusion. And then some more restrictive settings are, as I mentioned, District 75, which has smaller classroom settings and more specialized teachers supports. There are day treatment programs, either funded through the Department of Education, also known as a non-public school placement, or day programs that are funded through the Office of Mental Health. There are day treatment programs that are affiliated with different hospital systems in New York City, things of that nature. And then the most restrictive is, of course, a residential school program. And that could, again, either be funded through the Department of Education as a non-public school program, or through a mental health provider, through the Office of Mental Health or an RTC or RTF. So there's a lot of information here on the slide, and we're trying to give like a very broad overview of all the different options that exist. We really do encourage you to look at our special education guide to find out more about, non-public schools and that process and how to find a more appropriate placement if your child is not able to be served in their current environment. So next I want to talk a little bit and turn to talk about different tips and strategies. Again, this is just a reminder, we are not clinicians, and it's important for, a lot of what we're going to go over in the next few slides are just best practices that we found in working with the clients that we work with. But it's really important to really work with the school, work with your child's clinical team if they're receiving therapy outside, really make sure that like all of their services are coordinated both within school and out of school, and that, all the interventions are coordinated in a way that, they're consistent. And so, yeah, again, these are just tips and strategies that were recommended to us by clinicians, and some strategies that have worked with students in need of behavior supports. And again, I know I just went over specific things that you can ask for in the IEP process. These strategies, they can be made part of a student's IEP, they can be part of a student's FBA or BIP, or if your student doesn't have special education services but is just struggling behaviorally, these are just things that you can ask a teacher or a classroom or school staff to implement without the IEP. Obviously, if a student has an individualized education program or an IEP, they have more rights, right? And an IEP is like a contract. And so if it's in there, then, the school will have to be providing it. But it's always possible to ask and to try to informally advocate for these supports, even without an IEP. So just some general behavior management tools, best practices, setting clear, consistent, reasonable expectations, providing choices. Again, kids get bored, so be flexible. Something that you should think through is, sometimes it's okay to take the path of least resistance and be kind to yourself. This is hard. Validate your child and yourself. Validation does not mean agreement, but it's about communicating that thoughts, feelings, and behaviors make sense given your and your child's current circumstances. Here are some behavior management tools that you can be advocating for. Again, these are techniques that can be used in school or at home. Use of a visual daily schedule, cognitive breaks between tasks, movement breaks, verbal and visual cues for directions and staying on task, use of a behavioral contract, a behavior chart or a reward system for appropriate behavior, consistent use of positive reinforcement, and daily teacher feedback to the student and the parent. Some common de-escalation strategies that, again, can be put within a student's IEP or BIP, or can just be, something that you ask the school to implement if your child gets dysregulated. Having the adults stay calm, giving a child a choice, encourage the child to use, a chosen or effective coping strategy. Really show that you're listening and paying attention. And again, as I mentioned, validating the child's thoughts and feelings. Some strategies for children with language difficulties. So the use of a visual schedule, the use of a timer or a visual countdown system, using first then statements, and offering choices in a visual format. Some strategies for children with attentional difficulties, creating a simple list of instructions, using praise, creating a reward system, using consequences effectively, and establishing structure. Some strategies for children with low frustration tolerance, having them complete tasks one at a time, beginning with less complex tasks with fewer components and then building up to the more complex tasks. Returning to mastery or a task the child can successfully complete so that they feel confident and good. Offering choices, and then providing scaffolding, encouragement, and praise. Some strategies for highly active children. This might be obvious, but movement and motor breaks are key. The use of fidgets that are small and silent in a classroom can be really effective. Setting clear rules and expectations for behavior. And some strategies for children with anxiety. So using coping and calming strategies in the classroom. So listening to music on headphones, deep breathing, or potentially watching a preferred video clip. Promoting the use of active positive coping strategies through modeling, co-participation, and discussion. Having them engage in exercise or physical activity. And again, offering choices. You will be getting all these slides after the presentation. Hopefully the information is helpful for you as you advocate both for these potentially specific strategies within a student's IEP, or again, just more informally when you're talking to your student's teacher or school staff. So some problem solving. So I know this all sounds great. These are all things you could be asking for, but what happens when you run into issues? So this is our common escalation path. We always say to start with the school, talking to the school-based support team, the school psychologist, the principal, the parent coordinator. If your student has an IEP, its school-based support team is should be your first contact, but if they don't, you can reach out to, the parent coordinator, the principal, and ask for more supports. If that fails and you're not getting a response, or they're not providing the level of support that your child needs, then we would encourage you to then go up a level to the superintendent's office. There's a family support coordinator there. That's also where the directors of student services and the administrators for special education sit. And so if you're running into any issues getting these supports for your child, then you should reach out to them. We actually have at the bottom of this slide, there is a link where you can look up your child's school, and then you'll be able to see which administrator for special education, which family support coordinator is assigned to that particular school, and so that you could have their email information and reach out to them directly. And then finally, if that's not working, or if what's going on is pretty egregious and you need immediate support, then we encourage you to email the DOE Central's Office of Special Education, or specialeducation@schools.nyc.gov. There's also a phone number here that you can call as well. They're especially effective if there are issues with delays. I know there's a question about delays in getting a paraprofessional that was requested. If you reach out to them, they will reach out to the school and follow up and investigate and help, move the process along. Just some tips and strategies, be politely persistent is what we say. Definitely be persistent. Don't be afraid to keep emailing. Sometimes it's just a matter of making sure that people see the request, or that it's at the top of their inbox if you're sending the email, and just continue to reach out to these contacts until you get the support that you need. If the school is really struggling themselves to figure out how to help, and they don't know how to reach out to, that's when you can sort of advocate, go above and reach out to Central to see if someone in Central, there are all sorts of staff within DOE Central, behavior specialists, there are inclusion specialists, IEP coaches, people that should be able to provide the school with more targeted support. It's just a matter of getting those connections made. And then, of course, if you run into any issues, you could call AFC's helpline. So when to call AFC. So if the school will not recommend any new behavior supports, even though your student is in need of them, if the school says it can't consider any changes to an IEP or any additional supports until evaluations are conducted, especially with a student with behavioral challenges, a lot of these are urgent needs. And so as Ross mentioned, there are behavior supports that can be put in place even pre-evaluation. And so, that's also a reason to call. Again, as Ross mentioned, again, we also work with students that are going through the superintendent suspension hearing process or that are being disciplined. And so if your child is removed from class, suspended from school, or otherwise disciplined, you can give us a call. And then if your school is calling 911 when a child's behavior is not a true emergency, that is also a red flag, and you should call us to see if we can support, getting more supports for your child. So I will stop now for any questions and just give a few wrapping up reminders. I don't know, Ross, if you could send around this, oh, there we go. Send around our final poll here. If you could fill out this feedback survey, that would be great. Of course, if you need help, please ask. Call our helpline. You can also email us at info@advocatesforchildren.org. Yeah, I hope this presentation was helpful. We can stay on for a little bit. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A, and we can answer any questions you might have. Then I think I can also stop the recording now. I'll try to do that. Yeah, I can stop the recording if anyone has any questions that are specific to their child that we can answer in the Q&A.